At a certain point, many people notice something peculiar about themselves. The calendar shows a date approaching, a date that everyone else in their life seems to remember and want to acknowledge. Messages arrive, plans are suggested, attention turns toward them, and something in their chest tightens. They find reasons to be elsewhere, to downplay the significance, to redirect the conversation. It's just another day, they say, waving it off with practiced casualness. I don't really celebrate birthdays. And they genuinely believe this is a preference, a personality trait, perhaps even a form of maturity. Some pride themselves on this indifference, seeing it as evidence of their depth, their lack of vanity. But watch what happens in their body when someone mentions the date anyway. Notice the slight recoil, the quickening of breath, the urge to change the subject. This isn't the peaceful disinterest of someone who truly doesn't care. This is something else entirely. Something they're running from. But what if I told you that your aversion to your own birthday has nothing to do with humility or introversion, and everything to do with a terror you've never fully named? You see, most of what we call preferences are actually elaborate strategies of avoidance. When someone consistently dismisses their birthday, insists it doesn't matter, actively discourages acknowledgement of it, they're not making a simple choice about how to spend a day. They're engaged in what the philosopher Martin Heidegger identified as one of humanity's most fundamental modes of escape. Heidegger understood that humans exist in a condition he called being toward death. We are, from the moment of birth, creatures defined by our finitude. Every day brings us closer to an ending we cannot avoid and cannot fully comprehend. And this knowledge, when we allow ourselves to feel it, produces what Heidegger called angst, a peculiar anxiety that has no specific object but saturates everything with a sense of groundlessness. Now, most people cannot live in direct contact with this awareness. It's too much, too overwhelming. So they develop what Heidegger called falling into the everyday, losing themselves in the busyness and chatter of ordinary concerns, avoiding the confrontation with their own mortality. And birthdays, you see, are particularly dangerous. They are markers, counting mechanisms. Each one announces not just time passing, but time running out. It's like driving on a highway where every few miles there's a sign showing the distance to your destination. At first, when the destination is hundreds of miles away, you barely notice the signs. They're just there, neutral information. But as you get closer, say within the last 50 miles, then 30, then 10, each sign becomes more loaded with significance. You start calculating, comparing, wondering if you'll make it before dark. The signs haven't changed. They're performing the same function they always did. But now they feel urgent, almost accusatory. Each one reminds you that the journey is finite, that you're approaching an ending. This is what birthdays become at some point. Not celebrations, but countdown markers. And the person who dismisses birthdays, who wants to skip over them, who gets uncomfortable when they're mentioned, is like the driver who closes their eyes every time one of those distant signs appears. If I don't look at it, if I don't acknowledge it, maybe it doesn't count. Maybe time isn't really passing. Maybe I'm not really approaching an end. But of course, closing your eyes doesn't stop the car. And ignoring birthdays doesn't stop time. What it does instead is create a strange psychological state where you're simultaneously aware of your mortality and desperately trying not to be. Heidegger called this inauthentic existence, not as a moral judgment, but as a description of a particular way of being. The inauthentic person knows death is coming, but organizes their entire life around not having to feel that knowledge. They stay busy. They lose themselves in roles and routines. They avoid anything that might crack open the comfortable numbness they've built. And birthdays crack it open. They force you, if only for a moment, to count, to add up the years, to notice that the number is getting larger, which means the time remaining is getting smaller, to face the fact that you're not getting those years back, that choices made or not made are now behind you, that the future you once had is partly used up. Once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. The person who jokes about being 29 again isn't being playful. They're bargaining with reality. The person who says age is just a number isn't being philosophical. They're trying to strip the number of its power over them. The person who plans elaborate birthday celebrations for everyone else, but wants nothing for themselves, they're not being selfless. They're externalizing their anxiety, focusing on others to avoid focusing on themselves. Let me give you an analogy that might make this clearer. Imagine you're living in a house where one wall has a large mirror. For years, you pass this mirror multiple times a day, barely glancing at it. Your reflection is just there, familiar, unchanged in any way you notice. But gradually, imperceptibly, the reflection does change. The face ages, lines appear, hair grays, the body shifts. Now, at some point, you might start to avoid that particular wall. You might rearrange furniture so you don't have to walk past the mirror. You might replace it with a painting. You might convince yourself you never liked mirrors anyway. They're vanity, they're superficial. Who cares what you look like? But you're not becoming less vain. You're becoming more afraid. Afraid of what the mirror shows you. Time doing its work. The irreversibility of aging. The movement toward decline and ending. Birthdays are that mirror. Each one reflects back not just another year accumulated, but another year spent. And this period, this realization that you've been avoiding birthdays because they force you to see your own finitude, this can last quite a while. It can create years of awkwardness, of disappointed friends and family who don't understand why you're so resistant to something that seems so simple and joyous to them. And this period can last quite a while. Some people spend decades in this state of avoidance, crafting increasingly elaborate reasons why birthdays don't matter to them, getting irritated when others won't respect their wishes, feeling a peculiar guilt that they can't quite explain or justify. Because part of them knows, deep down, that their aversion isn't really about the external celebration. It's about what the celebration would force them to acknowledge internally. The usual response is to try desperately to either over-celebrate or completely ignore. Some people, once they realize their aversion, swing the opposite direction. They throw themselves into birthday festivities with forced enthusiasm, as if by celebrating hard enough, they can drown out the anxiety. Look how joyful I am about aging. Look how comfortable I am with mortality. But this doesn't work because it's still a form of avoidance. It's trying to cover the fear with noise rather than actually facing it. Others double down on the dismissal, becoming even more adamant that birthdays are meaningless, corporate constructs, narcissistic indulgence. They construct intellectual frameworks to justify their avoidance, finding philosophical and practical reasons why acknowledging one's birth date is actually shallow or absurd. But this doesn't work either because they're still organizing their stance around the very thing they claim not to care about. I must warn you about something. When you start to see that your birthday aversion is existential fear rather than personal preference, you might think this realization should make everything easier. You might expect that understanding the root cause would dissolve the discomfort. It doesn't work that way. In fact, for a while, it might feel worse, because now you're conscious of what you're doing. You can't hide behind the comfortable story of, "I'm just not a birthday person anymore." You're face to face with the fact that you're afraid of time, afraid of aging, afraid of death. And this naked awareness can feel more uncomfortable than the old unconscious avoidance. Now, you might think this sounds rather bleak. You're right. It's not cheerful. It's not a pleasant discovery to make about yourself. But Heidegger would say, and I would agree, that this bleakness is more truthful, more real, than the false comfort of avoidance. Because avoidance doesn't actually protect you from mortality. It just prevents you from living authentically in the time you do have. When you're constantly fleeing from reminders of finitude, you're not fully present in your own life. You're ghosting through your days, touching everything lightly, committing to nothing deeply, because commitment means investing in time you know is running out. And here's what begins to happen when you stop avoiding. Not immediately, not in some dramatic moment of transformation, but gradually, through a kind of settling. Let me tell you about someone I knew, a man who had spent his entire adult life dismissing his birthday, treating it as an inconvenience, something to get through quickly and quietly. He had reasons, good reasons, or so they seemed to him. He didn't like being the center of attention. He didn't need external validation. He was past such trivial concerns. But one year, he was sitting alone on his birthday. Not because he had arranged to be alone, but because he had discouraged others so effectively that they'd stopped trying. And in that solitude, something shifted. He wasn't doing anything special, just sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee. And he thought, with sudden clarity, I am 53 years old today. I have been alive for 53 years. I will not have these 53 years again. Whatever I do with the time that remains, these particular years are finished. It wasn't a happy thought or a sad thought. It was just true. And in recognizing its truth, without trying to avoid it or celebrate it or make it into anything other than what it was, he felt something release. What he discovered, sitting there, was not a solution to mortality, but a different relationship to it. He didn't suddenly become comfortable with death or excited about aging, but he stopped running from the fact of it. And in that stopping, in that simple acknowledgement, there was a kind of freedom. Not the freedom from death, which is impossible, but the freedom to be alive without constantly fleeing from death's shadow. He started acknowledging his birthdays after that, not with big celebrations or forced joy, but with quiet recognition. Yes, this is the day I entered time. This is another year of that entry. His friends noticed the change, but couldn't quite articulate what was different. He seemed more present somehow, more willing to let things matter, less defended. What had changed was not his circumstances, but his authenticity. He had stopped pretending that mortality wasn't happening to him. This is what emerges when you stop avoiding your birthday. Not happiness about aging, not wisdom about death, just a more honest relationship to your own temporality. It's not the excitement of celebration. It's not the relief of escape. It's something quieter and, paradoxically, more alive. The person who can acknowledge their birthday without discomfort isn't someone who has conquered death or made peace with aging in some final way. They're someone who has stopped organizing their life around not feeling their mortality. And in that stopping, in that willingness to feel what is actually true, they become more fully present in the life they have. They're not constantly monitoring for reminders of time passing because they're not trying to forget that time passes. They can invest in projects that won't be completed in their lifetime because they're no longer pretending they have unlimited time. They can love people deeply, even though those people will die. And they will die because they're no longer trying to avoid the pain of transience. It's not that they don't feel that pain. It's that they've stopped making avoidance of pain their primary organizing principle. So what do you do in the meantime? When you notice your resistance to your own birthday, when you see it for what it is, existential flight rather than personal preference, you start simply. You don't force yourself to throw a party or post on social media or suddenly embrace birthday traditions you've spent years rejecting. You just acknowledge the day when it comes. You might say to yourself, quietly, privately, I am this years old today. This is how much time I have been alive. This is 1 year less than I will eventually have. That's all. No drama, no emotion, just fact. And you sit with that fact without trying to make it into something else, without trying to feel good about it or bad about it, without comparing yourself to where you thought you'd be by this age, or where others are, or where you might be if you'd made different choices. Just, this is what is. And you watch, you observe what happens in your body when you do this. Maybe there's tightness in your chest. Maybe there's sadness. Maybe there's strange relief. Whatever is there, you let it be there. You don't try to change it or talk yourself out of it. You're practicing something that Heidegger would recognize as resoluteness, a kind of willingness to be who you actually are, rather than who you wish you were or who you think you should be. And most importantly, you stop doing the comparisons that make birthdays unbearable. You stop comparing this year to last year, this age to younger ages, your accomplishments to others' accomplishments, your life trajectory to some imagined ideal, because those comparisons are all ways of not being present with what is. They're ways of being somewhere else, some other time, some other life. But you're not somewhere else. You're here. You're this age. You're in this life. And avoiding your birthday won't change that. Celebrating your birthday won't change that. Only being present with what actually is will let you live the life you actually have. Paradoxically, it's only when you stop trying to escape from the counting, from the marking, from the recognition of time passing, that time stops feeling like a threat. When you're running from it, it chases you. When you turn and face it, when you say, yes, I see you, I know you're there, I know what you mean, it simply is. It doesn't disappear. Your mortality doesn't disappear. But it stops being this monster in the corner that you have to keep your back to. It becomes just a fact, part of the landscape, something you can acknowledge, and then continue with your day. Perhaps the reason you've been avoiding your birthday is that you've outgrown the fantasy of infinite time but haven't yet learned to live with the reality of finite time. Not because you're weak or morbid or broken, but because facing finitude is one of the hardest things a human being can do. Every spiritual tradition knows this. Every wisdom lineage has practices designed specifically to help people face their own impermanence. The Buddhists contemplate corpses. The Stoics meditate on death each morning. The Christian monks greet each other with memento mori, remember you will die. They don't do this to be depressing. They do it because they understand that only by facing death can you truly live. Only by acknowledging limitation can you make real choices. Only by accepting that you will not have infinite time can you value the time you do have. And then you're thrown back on something very simple, but also very profound. You're alive right now. You're reading these words right now. You have this day, this hour, this moment, not because you've earned it, or because you're special, or because you'll have unlimited more of them, but simply because this is what is. Your birthday marks another year of this whatness, another year of being temporally situated, another year of being human. And being human means being finite. It means aging. It means moving toward death. There's no escape from this, and your refusal to acknowledge your birthday is not protecting you from it. It's just preventing you from fully living in the time you have. And it's not nothing. This time you have. It's not meaningless just because it ends. In fact, its meaning is inseparable from its ending. A song that never ended wouldn't be a song. A story that never concluded wouldn't be a story. A life that never died wouldn't be a life. The finitude is not the problem. The finitude is the structure that makes meaning possible. You just forgot for a while.